Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined by
Carrie Clack, columnist, editorial board member.
Nancy Prayer-Johnson, deputy editorial board editor.
And we've talked a little bit in recent weeks about what's going on in the state legislature and particularly regarding LGBTQ issues, but we haven't really done a deep dive into it, and there is a lot happening. And to kind of help us make sense of it, we have a special guest. Johnathan Gooch is the communications director for the LGBTQ advocacy group Equality Texas, and he's also the former editor-in-chief of the Texas International Law Journal. Johnathan, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, glad to be here.
I guess I wanted to start. It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it seems like the bills that are sort of targeting the LGBTQ community in this cycle during the session have either involved going after drag shows, drag performances, or they're focusing on what's going on in schools, education, school books, what's being discussed in schools. And then there's also the category of healthcare for transgender youth, and also they've taken what was a focus on transgender individuals participating in school sports in 2021, which then they passed a law really restricting that. Now they're taking that to college sports. And I wanted to talk a little bit first about the drag performance issue. We've had SB 12, which was sponsored by Senator Brian Hughes from Mineola. And this is kind of part of a national movement. We've seen a lot of states that have proposed or passed anti-drag show bills this year. Tennessee has one that was halted by a federal judge just about 3 weeks ago. But I guess before we get into the specifics of SB 12, I wanted to get your thoughts on because I've asked myself this question: why we're seeing such an obsession with drag performances right now. It seems like in the last couple of years, there have been so many stories about backlash against drag performances, and particularly if children are present in various states. Why do you think this is happening right now?
It's a great question because I really don't know. It's puzzling to me because I can't make sense of the logic that's offered for it. It doesn't seem to match what's actually happening, right? Drag Storytime at a library is just a really animated performer entertaining kids by reading, which is like the most PBS style values you can have. And I don't understand why we can't all be on board with those types of things. But we are seeing this more and more, and I struggle to make sense of it, but I am worried about the consequences because we've seen that as this rhetoric about drag shows has increased, so has violence. And we've been tracking anti-drag protests and violent attacks on drag in Texas, and we had 20 since Pride Month of last year through December of this year in Texas alone. And that's just alarming to me because I can't make sense of the logic behind the push. And then I see these real-world physical acts of violence and intimidation that are happening at these performances that most of the time aren't geared toward children. Yeah. Most of the time they're not.
Well, that's the thing I wanted to ask you, is if you look at the language of the bill, it's and I think other states have done the same type of thing where they're saying, well, we're really trying to protect children from sexual performances. And they drag performances kind of get swept into that category, but they're saying, well, it's not specifically about that. Although if you look at Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and the way he's talked about SB 12, it's clear that this is drag performances are really what this is all about for him. But if you look at the language of the bill and it talks about sexual performances, you'd get the sense that all drag performances, anytime a man dresses as a woman or vice versa, that is a sexually oriented performance. And as you said, I mean, that's really not the case. I mean, drag performances kind of run the gamut.
What was Roland Gutierrez, and I think it was Sedan Patrick. But the whole Miley Cyrus. Did you see that?
Yeah.
Like, okay, so would Miley
Yeah.
Cyrus be able to perform in drag on stage? What was the answer to it?
I don't remember the
don't
answer,
remember?
but I think it's a fair question.
Yeah, it is.
Right? I mean, what is stereotypically masculine dress or stereotypically feminine dress? Does Miley Cyrus even have to be in drag?
Right.
If she steps out in boots and jeans, is that a cowboy outfit, right? So I don't, it's so vague. And it's alarming to think that it could intrude in all forms of performance. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about. I mean, drag goes back to Shakespeare, and there are traditional plays, classical plays, that include cross-dressing.
Yeah, and this country is so sort of conflicted and schizophrenic about this issue. I mean, I'm old enough to remember as a young kid, one of the most popular shows on television was Flip Wilson had a variety show. I think there was a period when he had maybe the number 2 or 3 most popular show on network television, and pretty much every week he played a character. The most popular character he did was Geraldine. Who was dressed as a woman and was very flirtatious with men. And I would watch it with my dad. And there were millions of young kids who watched and laughed at that show. And
Jamie Foxx, not too long ago.
I mean, there are countless examples.
In Living Color, yeah.
So it's a very strange thing, and I think you're saying that it's kind of hard to figure out what's going on, and I agree with you. It's really hard to make sense of this, but I almost wonder if it's just the drag has become so mainstream in our culture and so popular that is creating some fear.
Yeah, I think it's definitely become more mainstream. And I think that's definitely part of it, right? There's more attention on drag. RuPaul's Drag Race has won like 19 Emmys or something. So there's a lot of focus on drag. People are making money from drag. Small businesses in town are making money from drag. More people will show up. And I guess in some way I can see that it might be threatening if there's only one acceptable way to be a man and there's only one acceptable way to be a woman. Mm-hmm. And if you don't fit these very tight parameters, that can be terrifying for someone who holds a very rigid worldview. But what I find scary about that is that's not someone's personal choice to live their life one way and to identify as a certain type of man or a certain type of woman. They're trying to impose that on other people. To be a sort of gender police. What constitutes appropriate clothing for a woman, for a man in a performance, and whether or not that's safe for a child to see something that challenges those stereotypical expectations.
It would seem too, and I'm sure with your legal expertise, you've thought about this. I mean, when you start getting into defining what is sexual or what creates a sexual reaction, people, it's a very slippery slope. It's a really hard thing. Do we really want the government kind of trying to deal with these kinds of vague concepts?
It's very vague. And I think to get into the details of the law on this bill, I think one of the things that's interesting to notice is the way the bill has evolved. Mm-hmm. One of the first bills that Hughes filed was to simply include drag performances in the sexually oriented businesses category, which would have taxed businesses for hosting drag shows. And then it evolved and later became this version, which creates a new type of law we've never seen called a sexually oriented performance. There is no such thing elsewhere in the law. Right. The only thing that exists is sexually oriented businesses, which are those are adult venues, right? You get carded at the door and you pay an additional tax when you come in. And so we've created essentially a type of gender police, this new performance, sexually oriented performance that is prohibited for in public, right? Up to a $4,000 fine if you perform in drag in public, and up to $10,000 if it's in front of a minor. And that's just insane. That's insane to me.
Is it your sense that this is going to pass? I mean, it looks like things are going in that direction. Yeah.
I can't predict the future. I really can't. I certainly hope it doesn't. And I would say that in terms of public opinion, we saw an outrageous amount of people show up at the Capitol when the drag bills were heard. The gallery was packed. People were dropping cards. There were like 800 cards dropped against the bill.
You had club owners too, just saying this is bad for business.
It's really bad for business. Yeah.
I wanted, before we move on to some other topics, I wanted to, in Florida, there's a similar push, and this was a quote last week on the floor of the Florida House from State Representative Randy Fine, who has a bill, an anti-drag bill there, and this kind of reflects, I think, a lot of the thinking that's behind this effort. He says, and he's talking about the drag performer community. He says, if his bill means erasing a community because you have to target children, then damn right we ought to do it. So he's basically, I mean, the idea of targeting children, of course, is ridiculous, but he's basically saying I'm okay with erasing a community.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those. I was going to say rare moments, but it seems less and less rare when people say the quiet part out loud. But I think we are seeing that, and I do think that is the true motive. Not to get too far off point, but we've seen more and more extreme bills. Some of the bills that are maybe less likely to pass, but that are starting to show these genocidal ideas, right? Not just eliminating healthcare for trans youth, but for even trans adults, which is insane. Yeah. We have one of the largest LGBTQ populations in the country. And to think that all trans people in Texas couldn't get healthcare is insane. And that is tantamount to genocide. If we're talking about life-saving care and lawmakers are cutting off supply to life-saving care, they're deciding who gets to live and die.
And what we're seeing is, Republicans kind of defining this care as child abuse or something like that. I mean, that's really what's happening.
Yeah, the child abuse notion is terrifying, which we saw first start a little over a year ago when the governor issued a directive to the Department of Family and Protective Services to investigate the parents of trans kids who provide health care to their child for child abuse. And those are wrapped up in so much litigation, but there are a couple key things that came out of that litigation that I think are really important. When it first went to the Texas Supreme Court said, the governor doesn't have the authority to do this, right? This is beyond the scope of what the governor can do. And so now we're seeing the legislature step in.
Johnathan, could you talk a little bit about because I'm sure there are people who don't know some of the details behind this and maybe hear some rhetoric that would misinform them. When it comes to the process of children getting gender-affirming care, can you talk a little bit about the process that parents have to go through? I mean, this is something that I think it's a pretty involved process, and I mean, it's done. I think it's done with real care. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So you're right. Gender-affirming healthcare for trans young people is not really understood, and it does look different than it looks like for adults. So say you're the parent of a child who comes out to you, and they say they're trans. Obviously, the first thing you're going to do is find some experts. Maybe you come to Equality Texas or someone else who can point you to a friendly doctor who has some sort of expertise. And when we're talking about medical doctors, we're typically talking about endocrine experts. And then there's also a mental health component. So before any medical plan is set up, children and their parents are meeting with doctors and mental health providers to have conversations about what this looks like. And one doctor we spoke to said that initial screening is as rigorous in terms of the things you have to check as an organ transplant. They said there are that many things we want to make sure line up and are in place before we move ahead with a healthcare plan for a trans young person. But also what that healthcare looks like, I think, is often misunderstood. Because if we're talking about young children, we're just talking about mental health care, using the name, pronouns that they want, and buying clothes that make them feel comfortable, which is pretty simple.
What age? When you say young, what age? Range?
There were kids at the Capitol testifying that were 8 to 10. And so kids at that age, they're wearing clothes that make them comfortable. They're using a name that they're comfortable with at school, with their teachers. and pronouns. And that's pretty much it for kids at that age. When kids hit puberty is when there's more of a medical component, because puberty obviously brings a lot of physical changes. And so there is something called puberty blockers, which essentially give the parents and the kid a chance to hit pause on puberty so that they can make long-term decisions at an older age. And it's an intensive screening process. So many professionals are involved. And really the healthcare seems so cautious to begin with, right? This idea of puberty blockers is in order to make sure that everyone is comfortable with the plan moving forward and everyone has all the information they need. It's very consent-oriented to make sure that there are no missteps. And I think that's really important because some of the disinformation we've heard spread around is not from some of the disinformation. I'm struggling to articulate this thought, but so-called detransitioners who are actually suing their doctors for malpractice, right? Because it's the doctor that didn't follow the standards of care that are set by the American Medical Association.
So the problem isn't that we don't have standards. It's just that there are some doctors who maybe don't follow it, which that is probably true with all kinds of medical issues that people experience. That there will be the occasional doctor who doesn't follow procedure.
Which is extremely rare, and there are already laws in place that protect people from abuse by doctors. And that's an entirely different issue. But I think even our lawmakers are struggling to understand that. I know one lawmaker asked us, wouldn't it be great if there were just standards of care? And there are. Yeah. There really are.
So much focus tends to be, when we hear political rhetoric on this, tends to be about gender reassignment surgery, which I know in many cases transgender individuals do not choose to have. But can you talk a little bit about the laws surrounding, what age is allowed for that? Because I think there's also some misunderstanding about that.
Yeah, sorry, can you say the question again? What age is allowed?
Or what age you have to be to go forward if you decide you want to have gender reassignment surgery?
So surgery is a complicated issue. And as you say, many trans people choose not to have surgery. But in general, we're talking about adults, right? That's an adult decision. The type of care that young people get is this puberty blocker treatment, and maybe when they're about to graduate high school, they switch to hormone therapy. And that's typically what care looks like for young people. And there are study after study after study that show the overall improvement in wellness for these young people, which I think that's what we're talking about when we say life-saving care, is because there is a mental health crisis right now for LGBTQ people. Specifically trans people, and especially in the state of Texas. So I believe according to the Trevor Project, 56% of trans young people in Texas seriously considered suicide in 2022. 56% is an insane number that should be zero. And we know that this type of care reduces suicidal ideation. It's as simple as that.
Johnathan, not that there's ever been a time when the LGBTQ community isn't under attack, wasn't under attack, but in this current period, is there a tipping point over the past few years that has taken it to where we are now?
Another great question. It has been an interesting journey because back when we saw the bathroom bill pitched here in Texas, the business community spoke up, people overwhelmingly spoke out against it, and it was shut down. And that sort of seemed like a benchmark. It seemed like we were turning a corner where this part of the culture wars might start dying away. And then we had sort of a moment of pause, but then this anti-trans rhetoric started coming out, and we've seen this just blow up across the nation, and Texas is not immune to that. I can't pinpoint what did that, but I do know that there are a lot of really powerful and very well-funded organizations that are involved in this. In the last election in November, there were flyers being distributed by the America First Legal Foundation that were just littered with anti-trans disinformation and attempting to tie that to Biden. Biden wasn't even on the ballot, and it was very confusing. I mean, disinformation campaigns necessarily are. And so it seems like that type of national money is also fueling some of this.
Yeah. On the issue of school sports, as I mentioned earlier, we had a bill passed into law in 2021, which would basically require kids in school to compete in sports according to their sex birth sex, and now we have Republicans in the legislature targeting college sports. I think there are many of us who look at this. It has been sort of packaged as an attempt to protect girls or women's sports. I think there are many of us who look at it as kind of a solution in search of a problem. Because along those lines, I wanted to ask you all if Equality Texas has looked at the number of transgender kids who are or have been interested in participating in school sports in Texas. Because I think a year or two ago we had the governor of Utah who refused to sign a similar bill to the one we have in Texas, and he pointed out I think there were 4 transgender kids participating in school sports in that state at the time. Have you all been able to pin down any numbers on that?
We have not been able to. Part of it is that it's honestly just really risky for trans kids and parents to speak about this type of thing. I do know anecdotally of several young trans students that are actively participating in sports in extracurricular capacities, right, in order to preserve, like in non-school functions, in order to be able to have some sort of outlet, which is I think it's just so tragic to think about a child being told that they can't play a sport because of who they are. And it's so alarming that idea festered enough in the Capitol building to become a law one day. And I mean, as of last year around this time, it officially went into effect, right? And so it's been a full year now.
Ideally, how would you like to see this handled, either at the high school level, or we could apply this to college too? The NCAA has kind of struggled with how to deal with the issue. I think that they've tried to work out tests where if someone is below a certain testosterone level, then they would qualify for
like the Olympics
sports.
Yeah.
I think the Olympics do. Would something like that work in Texas, or is that a bad idea? I mean,
yeah, I know that the NCAA has tried to come up with a solution. I think what they have right now is, to say the very least, it's cumbersome. And so it creates these additional barriers to entry specifically for trans people. And I think that's important to realize, right? If we're talking about a level playing field, then you should be able to just run on. And it shouldn't be that complicated. And I do recognize that there's been this seed of an idea that's been floating around that somehow this is about protecting women's sports. But there's data from the Center for American Progress that shows that states with trans-inclusive policies actually increase their participation in women's sports, right? So there's evidence out there that suggests being more inclusive can raise the tide for everyone.
And I hate to go too much into the history of women's sports in this country, but I mean, if people who followed what's really transformed women's sports in this country, obviously, is Title IX, which was signed into law in 1972. And anyone who's kind of studied the history of Title IX knows that consistently we saw Republican lawmakers and Republican administrations, both the Reagan administration and the George W. Bush administration, tried to kind of repeal parts of Title IX because they thought that this was going going to be damaging to football programs around the country. It was going to take money away from football programs, and it was going to force schools to put all this money into women's sports. So there's been a long pattern. And again, I'm not trying to hold current Republican lawmakers responsible for everything that their predecessors did. But within that party, there's been a consistent sort of hostility to the idea of funding women's sports the way Title IX prescribed. And now, when it comes to the trans issue, suddenly we're seeing some of these same people in that same party talking about how they want to save women's sports. And,
yeah, I think funding would be a great way to do that, if that's really what they want to do.
Wanted to talk with you a little bit about education and how it's the legislature's handling this when it comes to LGBTQ issues. The ACLU, in their review, and maybe you all have different numbers on this, I think they've said there are 417 bills across the country targeting LGBTQ individuals, and 283 of them relate to education. And what we're seeing in Texas is kind of a Texas version of what we had in Florida, the so-called Don't Say Gay bill, which is trying to limit discussion of sexual orientation or gender identity in school. We've also had the attempt to defund libraries that have drag storytime events. When it comes to, and I don't know how you think this SB 1072 the school bill is going to fare, but what do you make of what is being attempted here? I mean, it seems to grow out of this old idea that that teachers may be trying to groom children. I mean, we hear that type of that term used a lot, and that any discussion of these issues is somehow part of that.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, with 1072, part of the evolution of this law is interesting because we saw them first attach the Don't Say Gay bill to vouchers. And then shortly after the House said no vouchers, they hijacked 1072, which did not have explicit Don't Say Gay provisions before the committee substitute. So this is a bill that's been introduced time and time again that is designed to eliminate student health advisory councils in schools, which give students a way to participate and learn about sexual health and things like that, to take ownership of their own education in an extracurricular space. And so this bill has never passed because, those are extremely beneficial for students. But now that same language was pulled from the bill that is effectively dead and tacked onto the bottom of this bill. So I just start by saying that to say that it really is a priority for these lawmakers to push this through, however they need to manipulate the system. I think it's really alarming to think about, I guess just to say explicitly what the Don't Say Gay bill is first. So the Florida bill banned discussion of LGBTQ topics through 3rd grade. The Texas bill goes through 12th grade. And that means that a high school senior will graduate without having ever had a classroom discussion about Stonewall, right? About anything that touches on queer history, the fight for LGBTQ rights, any of that, along with any other type of LGBTQ story. And I think that's doing such a disservice to our young people. Do we really want young people to first learn what it means to be trans when their coworker with whom they share a cubicle is trans? Right? That's unfair to both the student and the trans person, right? It's our responsibility to prepare Texas young people for the diverse world. Texas is a beautifully diverse state, and if we're not preparing young people to enter the workforce that looks like the Texas workforce does, then we've done them a disservice.
Are there any real, as a former teacher, I have to say, I don't know of any, but are there any real examples of grooming happening at schools?
I'm sure there are. we hear horror stories all the time, right? But I actually can't think of any. Unfortunately, what comes to my mind is the news is littered with stories of like the cover-up in the Southern Baptist and all of these types of things that lawmakers have not found a way to actually prevent grooming. And rather than doing that, they've singled out a small community and accused them of grooming without any justification. When we know that we have a registry full of people who are guilty of offenses. Why are we not studying that data to learn what we can do to protect children? If that's the goal, there are better ways to protect children.
What's been really depressing about all this has been the way it reminds me so much of battles that I would have hoped we could have were won a long time ago. And again, just because I'm old enough, I remember the Anita Bryant, Florida, crusade in the late 70s. And she was, as I remembered, she was trying to keep openly gay teachers out of the classroom. The idea that either she said this or people who were behind her movement made the case that gays and lesbians cannot reproduce. So the only way that they can continue to keep their movement growing or sustain itself is by grooming young kids. It was insane.
It's like
at the
teachers
time,
are
but
saying, you should be gay, you should be, transgender. It's just
I don't think teachers are saying
don't
that.
have have time for that.
But that was 45 years ago
They don't have
or so,
time for it.
and
Yeah.
we still that thought, that idea has not completely gone away, and it kind of blows my mind.
I think for historical context, right? These anti-queer ideas and these historic sodomy laws are in general the result of colonialism. And across the globe, there were a lot of indigenous communities where there were a wide spectrum of genders or sexual orientations. And despite the fact that these sodomy laws that came from British colonialism existed all over the world, queer people still exist. So that was hundreds of years during which there was no public conversation about queer people, right? It's not being transferred that way. There's no way to talk someone into being queer. You can't do that.
Yeah, well, it goes to the whole idea of the term lifestyle, which has driven me crazy for I don't have anything against the person. I just object to their lifestyle, and we never hear straight people having their sexuality referred to as a lifestyle.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a very strange
And
concept.
I think a part of it is Christian nationalism. I mean, it's very. I mean, it's terrible. It's the most hypocritical thing for Christians to say, to deem LGBTQ plus people like Satan, basically, is what they're doing. And I mean, it's wrong. They should. What it says in the Bible is you should love each other.
Yeah.
Right? That's basic.
Seems simple.
Very basic.
It seems really simple.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the work that Equality Texas is doing during this session to try to combat some of these bills?
Yeah, so we stay busy.
I would imagine Texas.
We do a lot. So our government affairs team is always at the Capitol trying to educate lawmakers about the consequences of these bills and just really spell it out because some of them do get really confusing and they're deliberately written that way. Bills that deal with insurance policies and what types of things can and can't be covered. Bills that would preempt local non-discrimination ordinances, right? There are some protections here in San Antonio for LGBTQ people, and there are bills that have been proposed that might threaten those protections. And so all of that is nuanced, and our government affairs team helps lawmakers make sense of it because while we have 140 bad bills on our plate, they've got thousands that are being filed, right? So we want to make sure they understand the bills that are going to impact the queer community and how they're going to impact the queer community. But then the other part is also just really making sure that the public voice is heard. So we want to make sure that our community knows what's going on, knows what issues are being discussed, and also knows when there's a hearing. so that they can show up, they can drop a card. If you're not familiar with what drop a card means, it's sort of a way to vote on a bill, but your votes get thrown away. But for the legal record, that's important, because if these bills get challenged in court, they can see that there was overwhelming public opposition, and that's important. And it's important that we register our voices in that way, like with one of the bills that would ban healthcare for transgender youth, HB 1686, which is the House counterpart to SB 14. There were nearly 3,000 people that dropped a card against it, and not even 100 dropped a card for. So I think that shows how Texans in general really feel about these types of issues. And on that day of the hearing, we saw people who traveled from all over the state. People that came down from North Texas, that came out from West Texas. And there were so many people for whom this was such an important issue. And so our role is to just make sure that those Texans know what's going on, because they do care. And that's one of the things I love about Texas, right? We really do care about each other, and we're going to show up to make sure that our lawmakers can't do something that would harm a whole portion of our community.
Which lawmakers are your biggest allies, and can you give some examples of what they've done?
Senator Menendez, our very own, very proud of. Senator Menendez has been a vocal advocate for LGBTQ rights this session. He has spoken up in every hearing, on the floor, and it's been very impressive to see him work. I feel very honored to have him as my senator. He's the first one that comes to mind, but the whole LGBTQ caucus has done an incredible job. Venton Jones, newly elected, has seen some progress with a bill he proposed that would repeal an antiquated law that is now illegal, that bans private same-sex relationships. And so that's on the other side of this, right? There are so many good bills that would update the law and protect the rights that LGBTQ people have, as few as they may be, so that they're not wrapped up in court cases, which, as we've seen, the Supreme Court is very capable of overturning historic precedents.
Before we wrap things up, I wanted to ask you about something that I've noticed we're seeing in our politics now, which is you'll sometimes see people, either activists or media people from the political right, ask politicians, how many genders are there? It's kind of with the idea that this is something that happened to Joe Biden when he was running for president in 2019. He was in Iowa, and a conservative activist asked him that question, I think with the idea of trying to make him look foolish or maybe creating a viral moment. Ideally, how would you like to see political figures respond if in a debate or in some interview situation they're asked that question?
It's a great question. I mean, my question is, who cares?
Maybe that's the response.
Why does it matter?
Drop the mic.
Yeah, that's right.
That's really all. I don't understand how someone else's gender impacts me at all. Right? My pronouns are in my email signature. That's the extent to which I care about gender at all. Right? And I think Texans are really respectful of that. I'm not. What did Biden say?
I think he said there are at least 3, and then I think the person was who I think was a staffer of Charlie Kirk's. You know, Charlie Kirk, the right-wing media person. Yeah, I think she was kind of a plant there to kind of ask him that. And then I think she kind of followed up, and he said something like, "Come on, kid," or something. We didn't say stop messing with me, but it was something like that. Come on, something like that. A real Biden kind of something. And I just think it's gonna come up. I agree with you. Like, I don't know why politicians should have to be dealing with these kind of questions, but my sense is that it's going to come up because it's. That's the nature of the political moment, right?
Yeah.
Johnathan Gooch, it's been great having you on the podcast. Thank you so much.
Guys.
And we hope everyone out there is doing well. Early voting starts a week from today. We're recording this on Monday the 17th, so it'll be a week from today. And we'll be back next week and be talking a lot more about the local election. Hope you all are doing well. Take care.